For this last lecture in the Absolutism and Enlightenment unit, we're going to transition now and focus on what the Enlightenment was, right? And it'll make more sense eventually as to why we're talking about the Enlightenment with this age of absolutism, because it's kind of largely a reaction to it. So the goal for today, right, in this lecture is to analyze the impact of the Enlightenment thought on European society. There's the first question here that obviously you're not going to answer because we're not in front of each other, but does anyone know what the Enlightenment is? And so ultimately what the Enlightenment was, it was a period of time in the 17th and 18th century, so 1700s, where there was a kind of a transition, right, where people began applying what they had learned in the scientific revolution, right, observation, scientific method, right, being very kind of using reason and logic to figure things out and to decide things. They took that information and they applied it to other aspects of life besides just science, right? So they applied it to the main things, right? They applied it to philosophy, they applied it to political science, right? How the government should operate, and to economics, right? How the economy should be run. So the Enlightenment comes to take what was learned in the scientific revolution and apply it to broader elements of society. And the reason it's enlightened is because it allows people, it promotes the reason and logic of individuals, right? And their ability to reason and to come to logical conclusions that are going to be more effective and better than just kind of accepting the rule of, say, one individual person because they said so. And so that's ultimately what the Enlightenment is all about. And so the main area that we're going to focus on, really, when discussing the Enlightenment, is its effect on political thought. During this Enlightenment period, you have a lot of different individuals known as philosophers, pretty much, intelligent people who use Enlightenment ideas to kind of explain things. And so these philosophers really a lot of them focus on what rights individuals had and how government should operate. And so this image here, kind of a funny image, shows two famous Enlightenment thinkers, or Enlightenment philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And they had competing ideas, hence why they're boxing each other here. And so they both use the same approach, right, logic and reason, but they drew two very different conclusions about how government should work. And essentially what's going to happen then in the following decades is that opposing factions are going to use their ideas to try to gain control throughout different countries in Europe. And so here's kind of a nice condensed list of the differences between Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Thomas Hobbes' book was known as the Leviathan. That was kind of where he wrote his ideas about government. John Locke's book was called The Two Treatises on Government. Hobbes came a couple decades earlier in 1651, Locke in 1689. They both had this idea of a social contract, right? And that premise is that all government is based on a social contract. The people and those in charge, the governed and the governors. And depending on who you're talking about, though, this contract is different. So for Thomas Hobbes, he believed that people were inherently evil, inherently greedy, selfish, and that when we're in a state of nature, which means when there is no government, when there is no structure, no society, that people are dangerous, right? And as dangerous, right, and because they're dangerous, people decide for their own interests and for the interests of their, close relatives and friends, that it makes more sense to give up some of that freedom, or a lot of that freedom, in exchange for stability, in exchange for order. And so in Hobbes' version of the social contract, people give up their freedoms to a strong central ruler so that they can feel protected and have stability and order in society. So not surprisingly, those absolute monarchs that we've been talking about are going to be inspired by this ideology, this philosophy, to kind of prop up their approach to government, which is absolute monarchy. John Locke's idea of a social contract was different, right? He believed that basically humans were naturally good, right? They might have flaws, but they're not evil or bad. And on top of that, every human has what we call natural rights, right? And these are not given to us by other people. They're given to us, in his idea, right, by God, by a higher power. And these natural rights, everyone has, and they should not be taken away. They cannot be taken away. And so people enter the contract that they allow some things to be given up to the government to make sure that their rights are protected, that those natural rights are protected. So whereas Thomas Hobbes thinks that this contract is entered into because people want stability and protection, and Locke's idea, this agreement is entered into because people want their rights to be protected. And in a state of nature without government, other individuals could ruin it or violate those natural rights. Right? So the main natural rights really are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to own property. Those are the three major natural rights that Locke talks about in his writings. And so those three things can easily be violated in a state of nature where there is no power, no authority. So in a government, the power and authority is meant to protect life, liberty, and property. Locke believed that if the government fails to protect these rights, that they're essentially not living up to their end of the contract, and so the people, individuals, have a right to revolt and rebel against that. Right. So whereas Thomas Hobbes' ideas are supported by the supportive of absolute monarchies, Locke's ideas are used by supporters of democratic governments and people who want to overthrow and limit the power of monarchies. These two are really important. These are two philosophies that we should understand pretty well because it's kind of the basis of this unit here. But there are other important philosophers to talk about. So quickly back here again, these two, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, are both English, so they're writing in England at this time. These three here, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot, they're actually French, so these are French philosophers. And their ideas are also incredibly important and come to, particularly Montesquieu, come to influence the United States in particular. So Montesquieu here is on the left. These ideas were his, that he kind of wrote about and espoused in his writings. And he believed that power essentially corrupts people. Right? Power is a corrupting force. And so how do we limit corruption and the violation of rights? You have to separate that power as much as possible. Don't give any individual too much power. And so eventually he comes up with this idea that government really should be divided into three different branches. The executive, judicial, and legislative. Right? The executive branch are those who are meant to enforce any laws and make sure the government runs smoothly. Judicial are those who are supposed to determine if certain laws violate people's rights or if they are illegal and if they can be allowed to continue. And the legislative branch is the branch that actually makes the laws. So so ideally a legislative branch makes the law, the executive branch enforces it, and the judicial branch determines if people are following it or if it violates people's rights. And so essentially all this is a system of checks and balances, right? Limiting and balancing power by dividing it. And this serves as the basis of the U.S. Constitution. Right? This is really how our government functions today, or at least is supposed to function. Voltaire talks less about the structure of government and more kind of broader ideals about what individuals should be allowed to do, right? And he was a huge supporter of freedom of speech and thought, that people should be allowed to think and say what they want without fear of any consequences. Because of the time period he grew up in and was surrounded by, he was actually kind of anti-church, not necessarily anti-God, but anti the structure of the church. He believed it was corrupt and that it limited people's free thought. And in a similar vein, the same thing with the nobility. He was anti-noble. He believed the nobility tried to limit people's expression and thinking and thoughts and speech. Diderot, again, was a huge proponent of free thought and kind of expanding knowledge and giving access to knowledge to many people. And so one thing he does is he creates an encyclopedia, right, which is pretty much a huge reference book that gives information about all different subjects and topics and individuals. So really here the main thing that these French philosophers promoted was freedom of speech and thought and limiting and checking and balancing power in government. Right, so this chart here is kind of a helpful way to organize these things. Again, natural rights, life, liberty, and property, John Locke. That's fundamental to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, right? The writers, Thomas Jefferson, right, when he writes the Declaration of Independence, he's using Locke's ideas to justify why the colonies are separating from Great Britain. Montesquieu, right, with the separation of powers, again, that's what the United States does in its Constitution. Voltaire, the freedom of thought and expression, that influences the Bill of Rights and the amendments that we have in our Constitution. That's the First Amendment, is the freedom of speech and religion. right? The abolishment of torture. That's another philosopher that we haven't mentioned before, but his name is Beccaria. He's Italian. Again, torture is not ethical or moral, he believed, and should not be allowed. And we have elements of that in our U.S. Constitution as well, with the amendment that bans cruel and unusual punishments. And again, Voltaire, religious freedom. Right? Again, that people should not be forced to follow a religion, should not be forced to pay and support a church they don't necessarily believe in. So these are all kind of a collection of important philosophers and Enlightenment thinkers. Moving away from the political end of it slightly and coming more into the economic end is a man named Adam Smith. And his ideas are also incredibly important for the history of Europe and the modern world. So in the year 1776, so he's writing close to a century after John Locke and over a century after Thomas Hobbes. So we've had about 100 or so years of Enlightenment thinking and discussions happening. And he produces a book called The Wealth of Nations. Right? And his focus is economics and how the economy should operate. And he's really one of the first to kind of formalize and really spell out the ideas of what a free market should look like. Something we call laissez-faire economics, also known as capitalism. So he's also kind of seen as the father of capitalism in that regard. Right? He believed that a free market should be regulated again by this idea of a natural law, that it's not people forming it, but that there's kind of just a natural, innate thing that allows and governs economic interactions. And he describes this natural law as the law of supply and demand. So essentially what this is saying is that when there's a high supply of something, but a low demand of it, it's not many people don't need it, the price of that good you're selling is going to be low. But if you have a low supply of something, but there's a very high demand for that good, then the price will increase naturally. Right? And so this was kind of, no one needed to be involved, no one needed to set prices, there's no need to set prices or try to control prices, just let it happen based on what is available and what people want. And so ultimately this laissez-faire economics, which is the free market and capitalism, says there should be limited government intervention in business ventures, right? Let individuals with their own capital, their own money and funds, invest it as they want, create new businesses, and let the law of supply and demand take place. Right? The government should not be involved regulating the economy. This comes to profoundly shape the Western world, and pretty much every country in Europe and then the United States in the 1700s and 1800s accepts this idea, and it's very limited government intervention. And even today, they're what we call a mixed economy. There's some government intervention, but largely individuals are allowed to kind of do what they need to do and produce what they want. Right? Capitalism has seen overall, despite its flaws, has been kind of the winning economic system in the world since the 1700s. Right? Another important element of the Enlightenment is that you have all these great ideas and these interesting ideas happening, right, among an elite group of philosophers and philosophers and thinkers. But in order for these things to really take hold, they need to be disseminated, right? They need to be spread out throughout the whole population. And so during the 1700s especially, you have this proliferation, this dramatic increase in pamphlets and newspapers. Every city has multiple newspapers. People are producing pamphlets and distributing them. Ordinary people who are literate are listening and discussing and thinking about these ideas. And they're especially appealing to working and middle classes, those who are traditionally marginalized from power and from the government at this time, are suddenly liking these ideas because it gives them more influence in the government. It allows them to protect their rights and be involved. And so these Enlightenment ideas end up inspiring many revolutions throughout the world. During this time period, during the Enlightenment period in particular, it's the United States and France. But there's also in the 1800s several revolutions in Europe. And eventually in the 1800s as well, second half of the 1800s, there's several revolutions in Latin America, the former Spanish colonies. And so there's Enlightenment ideas essentially help to form the modern democratic governments that we have today. And a huge impact of the Enlightenment on government and how people think, especially affects absolutism, is how people view the role of the monarch. Right? So even during the Enlightenment period, there were still monarchs who wanted to have close to absolute power, but their viewpoint changed slightly. Right? So traditional absolute monarchs like Louis XIV, which we mentioned, said that the state and its citizens exist to serve the monarch, right? The monarch is the top, and they need to be served by those beneath them. The new idea during the Enlightenment, and eventually we have something, a group of people known as the enlightened despots, right? A despot is a dictator or a strong ruler, but they're enlightened, right? They have a lot of power, but they're trying to do and follow the Enlightenment ideals that we just mentioned. And so in this case, in this understanding of government, these monarchs believe that the state and themselves exist to support the citizens' welfare. So that they're essentially, as Frederick the Great said, I am the first servant of the state. Whereas Louis XIV said, I am the state, right? So it's a very different idea there, a very different outlook on how government should operate. And this is a result of the Enlightenment, right? Its dramatic effects on monarchies. And so one place where absolutism is successfully challenged by Enlightenment ideas, ultimately, is in England, right? And so we mentioned in the last lecture about England and how Charles I was overthrown. A man named Oliver Cromwell takes control. He was a Puritan, and he comes to rule absolutely as a dictator. But when he dies, Charles II, the son of Charles I, takes control again and restores the monarchy. All right. However, Charles II has learned from his mistakes, and he has no interest in trying to rule absolutely. And so Parliament comes to have a greater say in what's happening. Charles II was sympathetic and possibly a Catholic to Catholics, and was possibly Catholic himself, but his brother James II, who becomes the king after Charles, was openly Catholic, and he was openly Catholic, right? And at the time, especially after this Puritan revolution with Oliver Cromwell, the Protestants in England, who made up the majority, did not want a Catholic ruler, and so, out of fear of Catholicism's return, they actually invite James's daughter, Mary, who had been married to William, who lived in the Netherlands, to take over the throne because they were both Protestant. Right? Because they're Protestant, the English felt more comfortable with them, and so James was afraid to face the same fate as his father, Charles I, and so he gives up the throne, and William and Mary take control. And this is called the Glorious Revolution because, unlike the English Civil War, this change in government is not violent, and what it leads to is it leads to limited monarchy. So William and Mary arrive, but they're not just handed the throne. The Parliament says you can be our rulers if you follow certain things, if you accept what's called the English Bill of Rights. And so this is happening right in the midst, the same years as John Locke's writings, right? As his Enlightenment ideas are being discussed and debated. And so this process, this Glorious Revolution in the 1688-89, successfully limits absolute monarchy, right? And ultimately, Enlightenment ideas overall, with the exception of Hobbes, really is against absolute monarchy because absolute monarchy corrupts and it violates natural rights. So this Glorious Revolution limits the ability of the monarchy to rule absolutely. It kind of emphasizes Parliament's superiority, and it gives the House of Commons, the middle-class, ordinary people in England, the power of the purse, the ability to levy taxes. Right? And this is kind of the prime example here of absolutism being limited due to Enlightenment ideals and ideas that are being discussed and enacted during this time period. So we're going to end the lecture there, and we're going to come back in class and kind of discuss and talk about some of these things and work on some activities.